So thank you all very much for coming. And I wanted to say a big shout out to the organizers at TASA for all their hard work in making this virtual event happen. I'm Olga Boichak. I'm a lecturer in digital cultures at the University of Sydney, and I'm also a new TASA member. This is my very first TASA conference, so I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be hosting this panel, and I'm very excited about getting to feature some of the Australian research in the field of digital war and the conversations that will follow. I joined the University of Sydney last year, and for the past few years, I've been a member of ASA, the American Sociological Association. So we have a section on peace, war, and conflict, and also a section on communication and information technology, media sociology. And also I'm an editor of a journal of digital war, which I'll talk about a little later because we would like to launch a special issue, to use this event as an opportunity to announce our special issue. I would like to start this event by acknowledging the country on which I live and work, the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, as well as the Gadigal people on whose lands the University of Sydney stands, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. And I would like to encourage our participants to use the chat function as an opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which they are joining us from tonight. I will now say a few words on the rationale for this panel and introduce our participants today. So this panel on participation in wars aims to foster a sustained conversation on participation that goes deeper and beyond the discourses of disinformation, media manipulation, and cybersecurity that tend to dominate the discussion of digital war these days. And so in thinking about hybrid conflicts and hybrid scenarios, it is really important to recognize that this hybridity manifests in many different ways. And without resorting to technological determinism, we could talk about the roles that are played by various kinds of digital media in affording various kinds of participation in wars. And in that sense, digital technologies do not simply offer new capabilities in conducting military operations, which they do, but also extending the battlefronts into the realm of communication, of perception. They tend to reconstitute the social conditions that shape people's relationships to wars. And in this context, sociologists are uniquely positioned to foreground these emerging participatory patterns in military conflicts and attend to these higher order transformations that challenge and transform our understandings of war, the definitions of what war is and what it isn't, and the relationships between war and other social domains. So these various kinds of hybridity that emerge in those deeply mediatized environments that are really interesting and worthy to talk about. And so this panel presents a collection of insights and perspectives on participatory futures of armed conflicts in a post-pandemic world. It is a great pleasure to have our panelists, to have them all in the same room. And I'm a bit sad that we cannot be co-present in the physical space. However, because this is a panel on remote participation, I think it is very befitting that that I will introduce them remotely. So Michael Richardson is a senior research fellow in the School of the Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales. And Michael's transdisciplinary research investigates the intersection of affect, power, and violence in culture, media, and politics, with an emphasis on witnessing and testimony. And Michael is going to be talking about Google's project Maven today and witnessing. Gregory Asmolov is a lecturer at the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London, and he brings a unique perspective on the role of crowds and crowdsourcing in military conflicts and in other crisis scenarios. Empirically, his research has been mostly concerned with new forms of participation in the context of crisis situations, including the roles of platforms and protests in armed conflicts and in emergency situations. So Gregory is joining us from London, and he's the only non-Australian researcher here. However, I must note that he has spent many years studying the Australian bushfires and crisis informatics and people's responses to this crisis. So that is what brings him here. And Ayesha Hassan, she's a war journalist turned academic. And Ayesha is currently finishing her PhD in peace and conflict media She has worked internationally in Afghanistan, in Germany, in Pakistan, and in Australia for SBS News Radio. And Ayesha's academic and research interests are in war and conflict and peace, in cyber warfare and digital activism and citizen journalism, and also online extremism and social justice. She is also an instructor with us in digital cultures at the Department of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney. So I guess before I turn it over to Michael, who's going to be our first presenter, I would also like to use this opportunity to launch a special issue of the Journal of Digital War that is particularly dedicated to participation. And I'm going to just share a link in the chat. Please circulate widely. This is something that Andrew Hoskins and I have been working on for some time, and we are really excited to be bringing together a lot of papers from different perspectives that are analyzing the various kinds of participation in military conflicts. All right, I guess this is it for the beginning. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. I think the format of today's event, we could just do 15 minutes or so of presentations, and then perhaps we could have all of the questions at the end. Would that work well with everyone? All right, perfect. So, okay, so let's hear from Michael.
All right, just going to share my screen here. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for organizing this panel, Olga. It's really exciting to be doing this with you, Gregory and Ayesha, to talk about digital war. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you as an uninvited settler on the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Today, I want to share with you a section of a chapter from a book in progress, which is currently titled Non-Human Witnessing, Affect, Matter and Media After the End of the World. The book makes the case that we need to think differently about witnessing, an act that has almost exclusively been reserved for the human in political, religious and scientific thought. So the book aims to kind of unknot witnessing as it's been conceived and reweave it as inescapably entangled with the non-human, and in doing so, find a renewed political potential for witnessing after the end of the world. So the book is about what non-human witnessing is, but also what non-human witnessing does as a concept for crafting knowledge and seeking justice. The chapter I'm going to read from asks, on the one hand, how algorithms might be agents of witnessing, and on the other, how algorithms might be witnessed. It looks at the false witnessing of deepfakes, the use of machine learning as a tool of witnessing, attempts to witness algorithms, and in art by Kainan Tan and various other people. And it also looks at Google's involvement in the witnessing of remote war. And it's this last topic that's the focus of my presentation this afternoon. While witnessing rarely figures in discussions of algorithms and artificial intelligence, terms that figure in witnessing discourses abound: truth, recognition, memory, ethics, and so on. This is not to suggest an inherent synchronicity or close relationship between witnessing and the algorithmic, or not necessarily, but rather to point out that both possess a purposive dimension to the modes of perception that underpin them. As Louise Amoore writes, quote, "A defining ethical problem of the algorithm concerns not primarily the power to see, to collect, or to survey a vast data landscape, but the power to perceive and distill something for action. In much the same way, witnessing is not reducible to seeing something, but is a perceptual encounter that produces an injunction to action, a kind of responsibility towards the event." So to quote Amoore again, an algorithm is formulated through a series of truth claims about its match to the world. And yet, in its use in the world, it is as prone to forgetfulness, oversight, misrecognition, and illusion as any other language game. Witnessing too makes truth claims about the world and is also prone to oversight, misapprehension, and misstatement. Witnessing is also prone to falsify, whether deliberately or accidentally. If we accept, even provisionally, my core claim that witnessing cannot be confined to the narrow figure of the human, and I won't have time here to kind of go into that in detail, but I'm happy to talk about it more in discussion, of course. So if we accept this claim that we need to expand the concept of the witness beyond the human, then we can also ask what witnessing might look like in the domain of the algorithmic. Distributed, multiple, contingent, and operative, their nature means that algorithms cannot be known or accounted for by a single unitary figure. So this presentation is pursuing the question of what distributed and decentered witnessing might look like within the techniques of the algorithm, and how such a contingent and multiple domain might itself be witnessed. So in June 2018, word spread inside Google that the company was partnering with the Department of Defense to apply its artificial intelligence expertise to the identification of objects in drone footage. A week later, news broke on the tech sites Gizmodo. A week later, news broke about this on the tech site Gizmodo, and Google swiftly lost control of the narrative. Following on the heels of revelations about a huge payout to an executive who'd repeatedly harassed women, the news helped spark the Google walkout, which is the first major labor strike in recent Silicon Valley history. Within days, Google had withdrawn its engagement and released a set of principles for AI development that precluded working on weapons systems, although with some wiggle room for other defense and national security applications. The controversy at Google sparked a new level of notoriety for Project Maven, the code name for the algorithmic warfare cross-functional team created in April 2017 by order of the Deputy Defense Secretary Robert Work in the US. Project Maven was created in order to, quote, turn the enormous volume of data available to Department of Defense into actionable intelligence, end quote, with an initial focus on providing computer vision algorithms for object detection, classification, and alerts, particularly from full motion video drawn from drone systems. In addition, the algorithmic warfare cross-functional team had a mandate to, quote, consolidate existing algorithm-based technology initiatives related to mission areas of the defense intelligence enterprise, including all initiatives that develop, employ, or field artificial intelligence, automation, machine learning, deep learning, and computer vision algorithms. Not only would the team seek partnerships with Silicon Valley, it would also adopt tech industry development techniques, such as iterative and parallel prototyping, data labeling, end-user testing, and algorithm training. In a reversal of the Pentagon's typical hierarchical, drawn-out, and multi-year technological development processes, Project Maven would be agile and fast. It would fail and learn. Move fast and break things, you might say, but with actual weapons attached. And just to give you some context, these images that you're seeing are all drawn from a slideshow that was made public, containing a bunch of information about Project Maven. I love military PowerPoint slides, by the way. They are like some of the truly most horrendously designed things you could possibly imagine. The kind of collapse of information and the lack of clarity, I think, perhaps speaks to some of the problematics within military bureaucracies and military imaginaries of the world. But I digress. So military secrecy makes even an approximation of the scale of data requiring analysis impossible to determine. Media reports suggest that the amount of data currently analyzed by the US military is a tiny fraction of what it collects. An article in Wired cites Defense Department officials claiming that 99% of all drone video has not been reviewed. Project Maven boss Jack Shanahan is quoted as saying that 20 analysts working 24 hours a day are able to successfully analyze around 6 to 12% of imagery from wide area motion sensors such as the Argus IS, which is a big fancy multi-camera aerial drone or sensor. Project Maven aimed to bring AI analysis to the full motion video data from the drone platforms, doing much of the surveillance work against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. By February 2017, Department of Defense had determined that deep learning algorithms should ultimately be able to perform at near human levels, but recognized that to do so meant working at scale. In its initial scoping, Project Maven was intended to enable a number of autonomous functions, including identification of 38 different classes of objects, reverse image search, counts within bounded boxes and over time, and selective tracking of tagged objects. So doing this would require human tagging of huge amounts of data accomplished using unclassified images and the labor of workers at Mechanical Turk and similar piecework platforms, often used to tag images for machine learning applications. That data could then train the convolutional neural network algorithms to identify and classify objects within video feeds, using iterative training and testing techniques that are quite common in the tech industry. In a future in which these algorithms are let loose on unfathomable troves of data from US surveillance and warfighting operations, we could think of them as becoming non-human witnesses of what might otherwise remain unwitnessed, the terrain of human and non-human life captured by the sensing and recording systems of the drone apparatus. Unwitnessed domains of life that have nevertheless been recorded and made available for potential future analysis. Stored as ones and zeros demarcating the position and status of pixels, these images are optical only in potential. Unless called up by a human analyst for display on screen, the optical, communicative, and representational modality of these images remains potential only. For machine learning systems, images are attributes, edges, and elements, each obtaining its significance and distinction only in relation to others. Full motion video of a village in Yemen, for example, carries no connotative or denotative meaning for the algorithm. Its significance is obtained purely through its relations of similarity and difference to the sets of attributes known to the algorithm. All such images are simultaneously virtual and actual along several dimensions at once. Virtual code carrying the seeds of actual optical imagery, actual correlation in the as yet unidentified scatter of virtual arrangements of pixels, virtual events crowding into the actualizing tendencies of the learning algorithm. So something that's flagged as significant, a truck moving too swiftly, a cluster of bodies on a roof, when that happens, virtual and actual coalesce to pull the sequence to prominence. We might name this recognition, which is the algorithm doing its job. But the algorithm does more than recognize. It forges a relation of responsibility. It lifts a set of relational attributes to the fore and demands action based on their significance. And it does so in the fraught ethico-political space of war. The name we might give to such an injunction is witnessing. So applying these same principles to activities more complex than object identification, like more complex than identifying a vehicle, for instance. So assembling machine learning tools that can determine that a particular confluence of objects and attributes constitutes a target or a threat, this both heightens the stakes of this kind of non-human witnessing and introduces new problems into the technical processes themselves. As Amor writes, when a random forest algorithm sentences someone to death by drone strike, the infinite, gestures, connections, potentials, makes itself finite, optimal output, selector, and score. And the horizon of potentials is reduced to one condensed output, signal. It's the whole of the world violently mediated down to a single output. So a random forest algorithm will never know a terrorist in the sense of acting with clear-sighted knowledge, but it mobilizes proxies, attaches clusters of attributes, and infers behaviors to target and to act regardless. Intensities of relation, in other words, spark the algorithm into response, action necessitated by clusters of machinic intensities coming together to stir a determination that carries with it an ethical weight. And in the context of the US military, that ethical weight might be a demand that violent action be taken in response. Despite years of conflict and tens of thousands of hours of drone missions, full motion video recordings of threats that might warrant lethal action or even tracking by drone systems remain too scarce for successfully training machine learners. Project Maven reportedly generated artificial environments to produce training data for threat detection systems. So basically creating fake imagery, inserting it into gaming engines in order to produce enough data to actually train the machine learning algorithms. And so a question might be, what biases, misconceptions, and fantasies are coded into such training materials? And how might the non-human witnessing of the algorithmic system be shaped in dangerous ways as a result? Both war and its domestic corollary, policing, depend upon and reproduce existing sociocultural codings, particularly those around race. Azahila Mebbe, Lauren Wilcox, Jennifer Rhee, Tyler Moran, Ronak Kapadia, and many others have forcefully argued drone warfare and drone policing alike are racializing. They encode and produce racialized subjects as threats, with threat and race intimately bound up with one another. And race codes into the drone system all too readily. This is because, as Ruha Benjamin writes, race itself is a kind of technology, one designed to separate, stratify, and sanctify the many forms of injustice experienced by members of racialized groups, but one that people routinely reimagine and redeploy to their own ends. Primarily deployed in the Islamic world, drone warfare simultaneously produces bodies in order to destroy them, as Lauren Wilcox writes, while, quote, insisting on the legitimacy of this violence through gendered and racialized assumptions about who is a threat. Identifying specific bodies as threats necessitates preconditioning them as threats within the system, which means determining which bodies should be coded for exposure, to borrow from Benjamin. Generating training sets from animations recorded in 3D environments begins with a set of decisions about what to include, what it should look like, and how those elements should be targeted. Both the production of data and the iterative development procedures used by Project Mayhem would be, it's more appropriate maybe, used by Project Maven, mean that the non-human witnessing of algorithms is meshed together with the human. Far from removing human partiality, such processes embed the discursive and effective logics of war in all their racializing and gendering dimensions into the algorithm at every stage. So optimizing the algorithm then is a kind of fruitless pursuit. Non-human witnessing in the context of drone warfare is thus not a move towards impartiality or the diminishment of the human, but rather the technical concretization in coded sorcery of predetermined meanings that are inescapably colonial and racist. Project Maven and its ilk train the martial gaze on the unwitnessed events of life in the age of drone warfare. Yet their witnessing is not quite analogous to the human. It is fractured and distributed within the system, an affective witnessing composed of machinic intensities. Trained to achieve certain outcomes, artificial intelligence systems deployed in real time or on archived recordings leave much that must remain unwitnessed. Non-human witnessing in its algorithmic warfighting form must necessarily fail to note forms of violence that are not pre-registered in the criteria for tagging imagery and reinforcing machine learning. Such imagery does not go unseen by the system, but rather its seeing fails to register. Algorithmic witnessing of this kind is necessarily narrow, not more efficacious or richer than the human, but stunted and strange. Yet what of the algorithmic witnessing of violence upon which it must be trained? What is the imprint of the traumatic on the algorithm? What might it mean for such algorithms to begin to be built on violent images and for violent ends? Might the algorithm itself be traumatized in a certain kind of way? And in what ways would that trauma feed into the unreason, the madness buried deep in the layers of machine learning systems? What price might the algorithm pay for its non-human witnessing of violence, not least the violence of its own making? Rooted in settler colonial techniques of categorization and control, financialization, climate modeling, and war fighting, as much as in social media and internet search, algorithms are yet another site of deep entanglement between human and non-human. Non-human witnessing of, in and through algorithmic processes is about finding those links and recognizing that it no longer, if it ever did, it no longer makes sense to think of the human witness outside the non-human technicities of our media, our archives, and their agential materialities. To understand witnessing as non-human is not to foreclose or cut off the political, but to refuse the deferral of the political from the technological, and instead demand that its politics be taken seriously at the very level of how we make knowledge and forge responsibility. Thank you. Looking forward to feedback and discussion and so on.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think you unsettled more than one binary in your presentation. But these binaries between these distinctions between weapons, witnesses, between human and algorithmic vision, between reality and representation in any kinds that you name it, right? There's more than one layer, I think, are really meaningful and really help unsettle and maybe make sense of the hybridity of the various hybridities that emerge. Yes, aren't we all? All right, so thank you, Michael. I would like to turn it over to Gregory for his presentation, and Gregory is going to unsettle another binary on the public and private space and the erosion of the two in the context of mediatized wars.
Yeah, thank you very much, Olga. Let me try to share my slides, and thank you for the opportunity to present as a part of this fascinating panel, joining from London. Just give me 1 second to share my screen, and hopefully you're able to see it, right? Can you see the presentation on your screens?
Yes.
Okay, that's wonderful. So thank you again, and it's a pleasure to present a part of my research related on the empirical project that I conducted as a part of the Early Career Fellowship by Leverham Trust for the last 3 years. And the title of my presentation is going to be Participatory Warfare in the Area of COVID-19 and the Erosion of Private Space. So what I would like to do is to present some kind of conceptual framework that I address in order to explore the concept of participatory warfare, and then to try to apply this framework in order to explore actually how new forms of participation have an impact not only on the field of conflict, but actually on our everyday life as well. And let me start from an argument that what I'm trying to do as a part of my research is actually to address the change in the nature of modern warfare, because we can see that there are a lot of different types of concepts that we are all familiar with regarding the unique aspects of warfare. If it's about hybrid warfare, proxy warfare, irregular warfare, boundless warfare, remote warfare, and there are a lot of different types of distinguished concepts that try to address what is different about conflict in the current modern times. But what I'm trying to argue that because of the proliferation of digital platforms, one of the aspects that we really need to look into is the role of participation and the expansion in the spectrum of participatory opportunities. And again, there are a lot of different type of contributions that focus on the role of participation. But what I'm trying to highlight as well, that the forms of participation are not limited to actually different forms of online participation that very often addressed by the literature when it's about participation and proliferation of information, when it's about generation of different type of content, but there are also additional forms of participation beyond sharing images, posts, and videos, and this is all enabled by new forms of digital mediation. So there are a lot of different conceptual frameworks that potentially can help us to explore these participatory realities. If it's about the notion of connective action that argue that the way we participate today in the conflicts really can also be something without being a part of some kind of organizational structure. If it's about the notion of affordances that highlight affordances of participation that enable us to take part in conflicts. If it's about the notion of mediatization that highlights how conflicts penetrate to our life through different forms of media. But I'm trying to address this reality based on the notion of mediation, and specifically the notion of mediation of activity that has been developed by scholars that are linked to cultural historical activity theory. And here the notion of mediation is really about something that kind of is located between us as the users and the conflict, and the new forms of relationships that are enabled by digital platforms. And from this point of view, these relationships are not only about consumption of information about conflicts, but also new forms of active relationships, new forms of activity in relation to conflict that are afforded and enabled by new forms of digital mediation. And something that the concept actually offers is to look on these new forms of mediation as activity systems that enable new actors to participate in new forms of activities around the spectrum of goals. And this is a generally conceptual framework that I'm trying to rely on in order to address these new participatory opportunities. Now, as Olga mentioned, and thank you for a very kind introduction, my work mostly concerned with the notion of crowdsourcing in the context of conflict, because crowdsourcing allows to identify the nature of participation as something that relies on the resources of digital crowds, because we can think conceptually about different types of resources that are mobilized in relation to conflicts, when it's about our capacity to see something, our sensor resources, our intellectual resources, if it's about some kind of knowledge that potentially can be applied in order to participate in conflict, if it's about analytic resources, when we are required to analyze something and our capacity to analyze data contributes to different conflict-related goals, our financial resources, when it's about mobilization of our financial capabilities, as in case of crowdfunding, as well as our physical resources as users to do something in relation to conflict as well. So here crowdsourcing is addressed as a form of digital mediation that allows to mobilize the resources of digital crowds in relation to conflicts. So conflict-related crowdsourcing is a digitally mediated mobilization of resources of users around conflict-related goals. And this is again something that allowed by new forms of digital mediation. So based on this conceptual framework, what I tried to do during my empirical work that was mostly concerned with the war in Ukraine, I was looking to identify new forms of participation and new types of activity systems that are enabled by new forms of digital mediation, when the kind of common denominator of these activities is really about mobilization of the resources of users in relation to conflicts. And I was able to identify a number of different type of activity systems and types of activities, starting from what has been seen in literature, mostly related to generation, proliferation, and verification of content, which can be also addressed as a participatory propaganda, different forms of hacktivism when it's also about online activities, participatory crisis mapping, participatory gathering and analysis of intelligence, as in the case of open source intelligence, crowdfunding, as I mentioned, when we talk about mobilization of the financial resources of the crowd in order to purchase different type of ammunition that support warfare, participatory logistics, when users take part in facilitation of different aspects to support warfare, if it's about provision of food or provision of uniform, and use the digital platform in order to facilitate these activities, not only offline, not only online, but also offline, and emergence of area consciousness groups that develop different type of practices related to application of drones as a part of warfare, and groups that related to tactical medicine and different forms of medical assistance that again emerge and coordinate the activities based on digital platforms. So that's a spectrum of a lot of different type of activities that we can see based on digital mediation and based on mobilization of the resources of users that can be considered as a part of participatory warfare. But what I'm mostly interested in and what I would like to focus as a part of this presentation is really related not only to the impact of mobilization of resources and digital mediation on the field of war, but actually on the impact of the new participatory opportunities on our everyday life. So this focus is slightly different because I'm arguing that these new participatory opportunities are not only about changing what's going on with the conflict, but it's actually about changing our everyday life as well. And that's the question that I'm trying to address, how the changes in the nature of warfare transform the everyday lives of people who are far beyond the space of battle, and whether and how war is integrated into everyday life and how warfare becomes a part of our daily routines. And here I'm also relying on a very rich field of literature that concerns with conflicts and everyday life. Starting from feminist security work by Cynthia Enlow that address the role of militarization, as in a famous case of the Heinz Soup militarization that presented by Enlo. There is a body of critical military studies literature that also highlights the focus on everyday life and the shifting boundaries between what is military and what is civilian. And finally, a prominent work by Adi Kunzman and Rebecca Stein related to digital militarism, as in the case of Israeli conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And here we can see the extension of militarized culture into social media domains, often deemed beyond the reach of state violence. So we see a lot of literature already that address some aspects of everyday life, and including the impact of digital platforms in the context of conflict on everyday life. But I'm trying to move step forward, building on the notion of participatory warfare to explore how actually participation in warfare is associated in the change with everyday life. And here I'm going a little bit back, and I'm focusing on the notion of interior that was identified by Walter Benjamin when he argued that actually the kind of internal space, the room that I'm speaking from now, different forms of domesticity are actually relatively modern invention. And this division between the private and the public is quite a new thing. And we can approach the private as some kind of pallet case of the self, a shelter from the external forces where we can actually have more agency over our own individual world. And from this point of view, I'm trying to focus on the interrelation between this war outside of my window that you cannot see right now, but I can see the window and London there, and my personal space, and the interrelation, the symbolic relation between the world outside and our private space where we supposedly should have more agency. In order to address it, I'm relying on the notion of the domestication that was developed by Roger Silverstone. And I'm trying to think about the household as a system of resources, again, as was presented by Silverstone. And this is something that we potentially can connect to the notion of crowdsourcing, because again, the resources of home can be potentially mobilized in relation to conflict. And then we approach the role of technologies, in particular information technologies, as a boundary breaching and breaking. So to what extent these technologies challenges the boundaries of our domesticity, of our interior, and contribute to the erosion of private space. So the question here, how conflict-related participatory affordances can potentially contribute to breaching the boundaries between the external and the interior. Here, I'm going to very briefly discuss my empirical work and one of the aspects of my empirical work was really focused on following how digitally mediated practice of warfare changed the everyday life from discursive point of view. And for that purpose, I focused on something that can be seen in the Russian-speaking segment of the internet as software warfare or software warriors, which is a lot of different type of memes that present participation in conflict from a domestic environment. And I try to analyze these memes as discourses that have an ambivalent meaning. And when on the one hand, it presents ironically the new reality of participation, but on the other hand, it also reinforces this reality and promotes some kind of hegemonic views of this new reality when the conflict become a part of our internal space. And just a couple of examples of what I mean by that, because I can talk a lot, but just to give some sense of the empirical data. We can see a lot of different images that describe the transformation of our private spaces. So when our bedrooms transform into some kind of coordination centers for warfare. So on the right, you have a meme that says that my sofa became a position of the general of sofa troops. So here we have a transition from the kind of very fancy military coordination centers to our home environment. And the domestic space to some extent become infected by the conflict through this transformation of our domestic environment. We see a lot of examples of militarization of domestic artifacts, if it's about remote controls for TV, if it's about our keyboard, if it's about our cups, if it's about the mouse to use the computer. So there is also the symbolic transformation of the objects around us. And finally, we can also see the production of new forms of identity. And here I conduct some analysis of different type of military badges that developed by internet users to identify themselves as the members of so-called so-far troops. And then also these badges actually are seen in the real life. So there is a transformation of memes into the real physical objects. And to that extent, the kind of mediation of the participation as seen in symbolic images transform into physical objects, and it's externalized and become a part of our real world as well. So that's a way of militarization works in our everyday life as well. So here I would like to make some concluding remarks about what that actually means. And my first argument is that we see, focusing on the analysis of the participatory warfare and its representation in our everyday life, we can see to what extent our interior become vulnerable to the external forces related to conflicts. So the rise of participatory warfare that relies on personal digital tools contributes to some kind of shift in the boundaries between the interior and the external world. The analysis of memes that I just presented, and there are much more, obviously, can kind of offer some evidences of the intrusion of a conflict into the domestic space and the militarization of this domestic space as well. So to some extent, the major aspect of conflicts in this new information environment is an outcome not of the struggle between adversaries on the battlefield, but of the location of the conflict in the everyday life of the societies involved in the conflict. And that's why the conflict actually takes place in our private space, in our rooms, in our kitchens, in our bedrooms, in our living rooms. What is interesting that kitchens are to some extent are more excluded from this militarization. So here we also can see interesting references to actually gender gaps related to participation and conflict, but that's also a little bit beyond this presentation as well. And finally, we actually can see that this trend of the penetration into our personal space is not limited to participation in warfare. We also can see intrusions related to different things related to digital labor and different algorithms that offer surveillance of our activities at home. We see arguments from the scholars of data colonialism, as Nick called, related to how our personal lives are extracted for the purpose of economic profit. So generally, there is a feeling that our domestic space is under attack, and the new forms of participation in conflict is one of the dimensions where actually this attack takes place. And finally, I would like to conclude with an argument related to the current reality of COVID-19, because what we can see in the case of coronavirus is a kind of explosion in the importance of digital mediation, because we have a less and less unmediated experience of a real offline world. And more as we experience it right now, we sit in front of the computers and we kind of have a lot of different type of digitally mediated experiences. And the increase in the percentage of digital mediation in our everyday life also offers much more space to these external intrusions into our domestic space. So what that actually means, that means that to some extent, our domesticity is more and more under external pressure in the context of COVID-19. And because we have to stay at home and because our life is increasingly digitally mediated, that means also that this external life comes more and more into our internal spaces, including things related to participation in conflict as well, because the things come more into our private life. So just to conclude, there is a famous saying, "My home is my castle," and on the left you see the Russian meme that also says in Russian, "My home is my castle," and you see some kind of representation of how the protection of home potentially can look like. And the idea here, in my opinion, it's all about the sovereignty of our domestic space. To what extent we're able still to kind of protect our personal space, which is supposed to be a space of our agency, from these external intrusions. And that's why we need to address the things related to new forms of participation and conflict, not only as something that is potentially can change the battlefield, but actually, first of all, that's something that change our personal space and everyday life as well. And the true meaning of user agency lies not in using the new participatory opportunities, but in the preservation of the capacity for self-governance by controlling the impact of these opportunities on private life. And it becomes increasingly difficult to resist the forces coming from outside of our homes. So I would like to thank for the opportunity to present this part of research, and wish to everyone to stay safe and hopefully to address some questions later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for a fascinating presentation. And I think it's very interesting how we transition from Michael's view from above and understanding what it means right through the data infrastructures, the role that crowds get to play in Google's Project Maven, and then looking at the role that crowds could play in the context that Gregory described, right? And also just unsettling these boundaries between domesticity and publicness, civil, military, symbolic and material practices. So I guess I'm going to ride that wave of militarisms into my own presentation that that looks at diasporic militarisms and also different ways, perhaps slightly unconventional, in which people can participate in remote wars. Let me just start by sharing my screen. Okay, so this presentation consists of two pieces. I really didn't want to make a decision, so I just decided to put it all in there. And let me just set up a timer just so that I'm not, yeah, okay. All right, so I will just go through some of the theoretical considerations briefly and then jump straight into my empirical context. The idea of human geopolitics is an idea that is coming from human geography, actually. And it looks, so this is Alan Gamlin from Monash University, whose book on human geopolitics came out only last year. And he's analyzing our tendency in social sciences to map populations onto a territory. That is what we traditionally do. And he traces back that idea of a violent conflict being a competition for population rather than territory. And he really says that that is the way it used to be the case until the 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia happened, which ended the 30-year war and established this ideas of state sovereignty, the inviolability of borders, the non-interference into the domestic affairs of sovereign states. And since then, in the social sciences, we do have that that assumption that a population maps onto a territory, which is something that actually was really interesting to observe the US elections only 2 weeks ago, seeing how mapping the population onto a territory is not really helpful in understanding the opinions of people and their voting preferences. And so these territory-based foundations of modern international systems and our understanding of wars that is based very heavily and rooted into these territory-based foundations has one flaw, and that is that methodological nationalism, where we just accept it as a unit of analysis and map people's identities onto the territories which they inhabit. And so in that context, diasporas are really interesting agents because they are these deterritorialized social formations that may really try to influence geopolitics in their countries of origin by using social media and other types of mediation. So it is just a provocation, perhaps, that wars have always been mediated. So looking at the history of the development of various kinds of media and various kinds of warfare, we can see how the proliferation and how the invention of certain kinds of mediums have or necessitated or enabled certain kinds of military conduct. And also how certain kinds of military conflicts have had profound influences on the social construction of these media. So this is, these are oral traditions, and many countries have very rich traditions of oral storytelling of wars, which they have employed. However, the first media war in history is recognized as the Crimean War. So in 1855, this is one of the very iconic photographs from those times. This is Roger Fenton, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, which was the first time when a certain type of medium has perhaps unsettled the ways in which we make sense of military conflicts, and that was done through the decontextualization. So this distance between the observer or the techniques of the observer and the military conflict that's actually happening somewhere has now expanded. And so as an outcome, the photographs get interpreted in a drastically different context than the one in which they were taken, which I think Michael has talked about, so I will not add here. But one interesting thing is that Roger Fenton, most of his time, Roger Fenton was a photographer that was commissioned by the British Crown, and he was shooting these heroic and iconic portraits of officers in the gardens just outside London. So the ways in which we think of wars, in which we make sense of wars, have been changed by the proliferation of photography as a mass medium. And since these changing techniques of the observer have really had some impacts on how wars were being fought, how wars were being perceived, and also they afforded certain kinds of publics. So the telegraph has ended the tyranny of the distance and has expanded the war's reach and scale. Radio has introduced the synchronicity that made it possible to constitute crisis sociality among the geographically dispersed listeners and making them susceptible also to mass manipulation. We all probably know of the Princeton Radio Project and all of the birth of the communication studies literature that specifically constituted public opinion and looked at how public opinion can be changed and how the population can be militarized, or can be how mass panic can be induced in the population and what people do in those contexts. So I guess echoing C. Wright Mills and looking at the epistemology of wars and how we get to understand what war means and how different kinds of publics can engage with the information about wars is really what I'm trying to do here. Then with the television, war has even got a stronger connection with the public opinion through the instrument of foreign policy. We know that the Vietnam War was the first televised war in history, and so the CNN effect, the living room war. So I guess that also echoes with Gregory's, with the ways in which war enters the domestic spaces and becomes part of the life world. So my principal interest is how this happens in the digital age, right? We know of the idea of diffused warfare when it is really impossible to trace the different causes and effects, when it is possible to broadcast different information from different vantage points. And so this mass mediation is kind of losing its hold on the ways in which information is diffused, is amplified in these environments around wars. The anecdote that animates my interest in diasporas is the story that became viral in 2015. So this boy's name is Daniel. He is, back then, he was a 10-year-old boy who ran a birthday fundraiser to purchase an SUV, which he donated to the Ukrainian army fighting in the Ukrainian-Russian war in the east of Ukraine, which has been ongoing since 2014. And so here you see two photographs side to side, this little boy with a handful of cash and the smiling soldier with a thank you card. And so I remember back then I had a son who was 9, and my son was 9 back then, and I showed him this picture and he said, wow, have they run out of tanks? And so for him, that was such a regular thing. He's like, of course he deployed a vehicle because that's what anybody would do. So the idea that this SUV was actually real and this was a pretty brave and selfless act of diasporic humanitarianism wasn't really something that my own son thought was strange. So I was trying to uncover the vast social infrastructure that has to connect this boy who is a minor citizen of a foreign country with an active military battlefront. And so my interest was whether these kinds of diasporic humanitarianisms are common, whether we can see that happening at scale, and maybe we could witness some of the new forms of diasporic humanitarianism that emerges around wars. And so what I did was I scraped the online conversation. I was doing this project as part of my visiting scholarship in Canada at Ryerson University with Anatoly Gruzd, who's the director of Social Media Lab in Canada. And so what we did was we had a list of public diasporic communities on Facebook, and we collected historical data on these diasporic communities. These are the dates in which we collected that data, and March 2014 was when the conflict had started, and then March 2018 was actually a month before Facebook had closed its APIs and made the data inaccessible to public. So I probably would have collected more if I could, but I consider myself very lucky that I was at least able to get this far. So these are kind of my descriptives. I had 5 diasporic groups on Facebook from Canada, 5 from the United States, 5 from Poland, and 1 from Israel. And I was trying to see the ways in which militarisms manifest in the platform-mediated conversations on Facebook. So this is shortly my method. I will not focus on it too much. But what I did, I compiled the text corpus, I translated it into English, I visualized the semantic networks from that text corpus that I had, which is basically the connections between the nouns that co-occur in a body of speech. That would be a post or a comment. And I was trying to identify discursive constructs within the topics that would signify certain kinds of involvement with the Ukrainian conflict. I then validated the topics, and then I could compare the structures of discourse among these 4 groups in question. And as you see, this is a brilliant example of methodological nationalism, because I still group these communities by countries, and there's no way to bypass it, but at least I was trying to see what the conversation was among them. And so here you can see that the prominence of Ukraine in all of those diasporic discussions, which was kind of unsurprising, except for Poland, where Poland was actually a more prominent kind of construct or noun that was more central to their conversations. However, I also saw distinct conversations happening about the war and about humanitarianism. And as we can see here in this group, Ukrainians in Canada, there were 6 clusters. So one of them was, so clusters basically represent topics, and we can run community detection algorithms to see whether certain collection of nouns constitute a topic or not. It's really messy, and sometimes the topics don't neatly cluster into, the conversations don't neatly cluster into topics, but that's okay. Among the clusters that I found in Canada, there was discussion of Ukrainian politics. There was also a separate discussion of the armed conflict. And finally, what I was most excited about, there was discussion of grassroots humanitarian efforts that were happening among those diasporic communities. So this act of diasporic humanitarianism, where a boy would donate something to the Ukrainian army, were actually we could discover them at scale, which suggested that that was not an anecdotal or just a one-off behavior, and that diasporas are actually really actively contributing to trying to challenge the geopolitical status quo in their home country, at least in this case with the Ukrainian diasporas. And also I saw local integration efforts, which diasporas are famous for, and which in which they make very supportive communities in their countries, in their host countries, and some cross-platform engagement. So that was something that I was also really interested in, to map the geographies of diasporic mobilization, to see what kinds of content they're linking to, where that content was produced, by whom, so within and outside Facebook. So this is just an example of hyperlinking. So understanding that hyperlinks are the socio-semiotic trace that connects diasporic groups on Facebook to other online spaces, and seeing what kinds of content really are used to mobilize, and what are the geographies of these diasporic militarisms. So this is the data that I chose to analyze more in depth. These were just all of the Canadian groups on Facebook. I parsed the hyperlinks that they were sharing, and I was trying to map the kind of boundaries of the diasporic mobilization. So these are just some of the things that I have tracked about the hyperlinks that were shared. What kind of content does the URL link to? And so basically I manually visited those hyperlinks and tried to see what was going on there. What language was the content in? Is the content related to Ukraine? Does the content contain mobilization frames or calls to action? And finally, where was it produced? So this is just one of the so-called mattering maps that I produced as part of this project. So as we see, a lot of the, and I think I'll end the slideshow, and I'll try to just expand it a little bit more, just so that you could hopefully see it better, just because it's super small. So as you can see, Facebook affordances tend to play a really important role in diasporic mobilization. And if we could see, there's all these many kinds of different content that was shared, and a lot of it was actually hosted on Facebook or using different Facebook affordances such as event, fundraiser, or community to make that happen. So in Ukrainians in Montreal, we could also see that they were linking more to other communities than other groups. However, we see that Facebook is a very prominent kind of hub of diasporic mobilization. Ukrainians in Canada, we can see a very direct link among the most popular content types in Canada, which was the fundraisers. And then some of them were originated in Ukraine and the others were just produced on Facebook. Here in the Ukrainian-Canadian connection, we could see also Facebook playing a prominent role, as well as the United States. And here we could see Canadian Ukrainians and friends that fundraisers were the most prominent type of mobilizing content, and most of them were hosted on Facebook. So just our understanding of fighting remote wars in digital age, what are some of the factors and some of the types of content that mobilize diasporic groups for this kind of activism? That would be identity formation via news, that would be causes, so fundraisers and events that would be organized by those groups, the positionality within other networks, online and offline communities, and also integration with local and international governance institutions. So that would be different petitions and such like. And so going forward, I have a book chapter in press on mediatized conflicts from sociological perspective. I also have a forthcoming methods paper on these semantic networks, another paper on mapping the national web, and finally my book project that is going to explore diasporic humanitarianism in the digital age by looking at the largest conflict-generated diasporic communities in Australia. So that would be the Iraqi community, the Afghan community, and the Ukrainian community that are, and I'm going to see how they are involved in the wars in their homeland. So this is it for me. Thank you so much. Let me stop sharing my screen. I can only find how to do it. Okay. All right. So thank you very much. And I guess I'll turn it over to Ayesha, who will continue riding the wave of diasporic mobilization from a slightly different perspective.
Thank you, Olga. All right. Looks good. So I am, as Olga said, going to be taking from where actually you guys ended, which was basically about mediation and diasporic mobilization, which is what the main theme of my this research paper that is being worked at right now. So basically, what I am looking at is the Pashtun diaspora in Australia. So as you can see, I'll just explain a bit about an abstract about what my work is. The access to computational technologies and the internet has redefined the personalization of politics and contributed to shifting participatory patterns in military conflicts around the world. Basically, what I'm trying to look at is this participation by the Pashtun diaspora in Australia. Now, digital activism alters the means of opportunities for diaspora to engage in transitional justice activities, including the situations of ongoing conflict or the repression in their original homelands. I specifically chose the Pashtun diaspora in Australia, although it is an atypical but highly informative case of examination. If you do look at the numbers, I was looking at Olga's numbers of the Afghan refugees or Afghan diaspora, and I saw that she had mentioned about 40,000. I was talking to the executive producer of SBS Pashto this morning, and he said that in the last 5 years, they have doubled. So from 70,000, they may now be looking at around 140,000. This is just what I just talked to him this morning. So basically, when we look at such a big and a growing diaspora, and I will go on to explaining who the Pashtun diaspora actually are. They're not just from Afghanistan. So these opportunities have led to the emergence of new cultures and patterns of virtual participation and the digital praxis of alter-activism. Now, I use the word alter-activism and not just digital activism or diasporic activism online, is because alter-activism is emerging, and it also includes young people and older generations within a multicultural society such as Australia. It gives them new meanings to their identity and citizenship, and that's why and alters their understanding of the construction of the image that they attach to themselves in a multicultural society, especially when they are separated in two countries by birth, and then by growing up in a different multicultural environment. So what I've done is that I have done an analysis of the shared discourses through in-depth interviews, and what I'm trying to do is explore the emerging trends of digital participation among Australian Pashtuns who are successfully supporting a civil and human rights non-violent resistance movement in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I would like to present my main arguments that are, can you see my screen? Can you still see my, okay. So what I'm trying to look for three answers to three major questions that did also develop while I was talking to this diaspora community. First of all, how much have the Pashtun diaspora in Australia contributed to PTM? Now, PTM is the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, a civil rights movement for the rights and the freedom of Pashtun ethnicity, and I will be talking about this in the next slide. So how much have they contributed to PTM vis-a-vis awareness, mobilization, and networked collaboration? The other major question that arises from the set of data that I have and the findings that I've made so far is what concerns arise about group identity and the interests that may affect diasporic attitudes and activism towards conflict resolution and peace negotiations in their homeland regions. And the most important, which is also related to somehow what I'm also doing in my PhD, is can alter activism among diasporic communities on social media be considered as citizen journalism, and if or not this can be added to my model of peace and non-peace discourses in media framing and coverage. So when I say non-peace or peace discourses, I want to give a counter paradigm to the conventional peace and war journalism model, because as I argue in my other research as well, that just as the absence of love is not hate, the absence of war is not peace. And so if you are in a post-war or post-conflict situation within your country or as a diaspora away from your homeland, it does not primarily mean that the country is in peace and that activism is not needed anymore. And so therefore I further divide this as peace and non-peace discourses instead of peace and war discourses. I'll just explain a little bit about who the Pashtun diaspora are in Australia and what the PTM, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, is. So the Pashtuns that are historically known as the Afghans are the largest ethnic group geographically distributed across Pakistan and Afghanistan. They are the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan and the second largest in Pakistan. There are about 62,000 Pakistani-born Australian citizens and about 47,000 Afghan-born. Now, this is from 2016 census, and these are first-generation migrants who weren't born here and directly came here, which means that the only number that we're given of who the Afghan refugees or the Afghan migrants or Afghan residents in Australia are, this number projects them even more than that, because now we're looking at Pashtuns not only from Afghanistan but also from Pakistan because of their shared border and regional conflicts. Most Afghans and Pakistani are multilingual, which means they can speak Pashto or Dari, Urdu and Punjabi, which also again brings me to conclusion that I'm not only specifically looking at people who can only speak Pashto or can only speak Dari. So there is a set of people who engage in online participatory digital activism and alter activism, who may or may not speak Pashto, but do stand up for the rights of Pashtun in the country and outside. There is a limited study of the use of digital platforms among diaspora for participation in conflict. And as I said, Pashtun diaspora is specifically atypical. The Pashtun diaspora, both from Afghanistan and from Pakistan, are an untapped area of scholarship. A little bit about who started this presentation. But before, so it was led by a young Pashtun, Manzoor Ahmed Pashtun, and it is a powerful civil and human rights movement that has rattled Pakistan's political and military establishment, and by drawing huge crowds, majorly Pashtun supporters from Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now, they have had a major impact on Pashtuns, especially young people who use social media, and have triggered a rise in the use of social media for awareness, mobilization, and networked collaborations. Its wide-scale use of digital media for transnational activism has made the group one of the most, can't see my slides?
We could actually, we just see your title slide. If you could maybe flip through.
All right, let me have a look. I'm actually, I should have timed it. Let me stop sharing the screen. Let me just share it one more time. Can you see my screen now? Yes, but I will use a slideshow and I will have to go back. Actually, this morning, my second screen just decided that it doesn't want to work anymore. And so that's why I'm struggling with this. Okay, so this is led by Manzoor Ahmed Pashtun. He is a young Pashtun and an activist. He started this in 2014, but in the last few years, it has risen to become one of the biggest movement of the Pashtun people, not only in Pakistan, but also in Afghanistan. Its latest manifestations of decades of Pashtun protest against state oppression specifically. Its origin can be traced back to 2014, but it picked up in the last 2 to 3 years, specifically in diasporic communities. So it's basically seeking for a redressal of Pashtun grievances within the bounds of Pakistani constitution, and demands that the army and security forces be held accountable for terrorism and unrest, as well as an arbitrary detention and unexplained disappearances of hundreds of Pashtun men, and the killing of some in what is believed to be staged police encounters. Now, there have also been some unexplained arrests of women members, but they were later released after questioning. On the other hand, the army, the Pakistani army, is systematically, or the military establishment, as I would like to say, is systematically seeking to discredit the PTM by questioning its patriotism and the patriotism of its leaders and activists, and dubbing them as agents of foreign powers hostile to Pakistan, most importantly, or most specifically targeting at Afghanistan. So by making Pakistan's political and military establishment sit up, the PTM has been successful in raising some awareness about the plights of Pashtuns among Pakistani public and in Afghanistan. But the army has conceded some of the demands that the PTM have been making. For example, one of them was to bring an end to an extrajudicial killing, to release missing persons, to stop humiliation of Pashtuns at security checkpoints, and most importantly, the removal of landmines in the federal tribal areas, federally administered tribal areas, which became a source of a lot of deaths in the last 2 to 3 years. Or even more than that. However, so what happened was that the court in 2018, through army, successfully banned all PTM public gatherings, and also banned all national and private media from giving PTM any airtime and any coverage. So this led to the PTM leadership to then bring social media in their primary use for awareness, mobilization, and collaboration. This has become a convenient way for overseas Pashtun communities to also participate in the movement equally. They have been using 2 major hashtags, in fact 3 major hashtags or slogans, as you can see, and these have been termed as provocative by the military establishment in Pakistan. So basically, as you can see, some snapshots of how the Pakistani military had been attacking the freedom of right, and this also rose a big debate about freedom of right, not freedom of speech, not only among Pakistanis, but also specifically about in Australian Pashtuns as well. So I'm here going to make a little bit of connection between what is alter activism, and then I'm going to go back to why am I connecting alter activism to Pashtun diaspora in Australia. So by analyzing these users' social media performativity, if I can say, we can obtain an insight into how social media spaces may help construct ethnic and also transnational identities according to boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. So in this specific article, I'm trying to demonstrate how Pashtun diaspora in Australia, individuals are embedded into the inclusivist social mobilization by a populist, non-violent movement back in their homeland. Alter activism is an emerging collaborative political praxis, and as I mentioned earlier as well, it brings young people to represent an alternative mode of subcultural practice for political commitment, cultural expression, and most importantly, collaborative practices. It involves an emphasis on lived experiences and a process, a commitment to horizontal networked organizations. Alter activism, and I'm quoting from Yuri St. Clair's work, quote, alter activism is more highly globalized, more profoundly networked, and more open and collaborative, and more deeply shaped by new technologies than its predecessors. And Shane argues that the diasporic, and she specifically looks at the Syrian refugees, of how diaspora's role in homeland conflict can either perpetuate it or can also end up in becoming a reason for conflict resolutions, and it can be quite powerful. Some of the major PTM rallies that have happened in Pakistan, in Australia, they actually started from 2018, but they became more collaborative and more mobilized or more coordinated in 2019. So I am specifically looking at the data set that I'm looking at have either led these, administered these, coordinated these, or have participated in these. And these are not just small rallies. These have had people, thousands of people attending it in major sections of the city. So what I have done is that I have, I'm focusing on doing 15 in-depth interviews with people, PTM activists who are based in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Darwin, to also gauge the spread and the scope of activism, alter activism within the Pashtun diasporas. They are, so far, my minimum age has been 22 and the maximum is 55 years. All these interviewees are a part of the admin team, either as coordinators or moderators in 3 major local Facebook groups, only dedicated to PTM related either awareness or collaboration for any events that may be happening, community meetings, protests, or just workshops. 3 of them are also moderators for a local WhatsApp group, to which I was also added to keep, to just become part of that conversation and to be able to monitor it. I have looked at 3 major groups, PTM Australia, Facebook groups, Pakhtun Tahaffuz Movement, PTM Sydney, and PTM Australia Official. PTM Australia Official is run by people in Sydney, and PTM Australia is run by people who are based in Melbourne. And I'm also looking at 2 WhatsApp groups that are also part of these Facebook groups, but they're mostly used for coordination and communication. So the most common themes that I found in these interviews, half of which have been done and some of them are scheduled in the next few weeks, is that all these people had a shared set of political or cultural practices. They are mostly from largely urban and middle class areas in Australia. So these themes basically lead to an examination of diasporas as a 3rd level players in peace negotiations, determining the fate of some movements in their homelands. I also noticed that there was also a familiarity of ease of interaction, as if everyone had known each other for years, which is not the point, which is not necessarily true. there was a horizontal organization within the group, and they focused on collaborative networking. So, which means that there was also, one of the participants also mentioned how they are creating an online database of evidence of possible rights violation that may have happened in Pakistan or Afghanistan, but is being collaborated or curated here by group members. Then there was grassroots counterpower. They are specifically focusing on mobilizing and making the youth aware. So the third generation or Pashtuns, Pakistani or Afghan, who are born in this country. There is an alliance building, contrary to how Pakistan and Afghanistan share quite hostile political relations. There has been an alliance building that I noticed in these groups, although some of them were Afghan Pashtuns and some of them were Pakistani Pashtuns, but there was no divide noted among them when it came to social activism or digital activism for PTM. I noticed a creative or a connective action. So connective action is made possible by several affordances of digital platforms, as Gregory and Olga already discussed about some of the affordances of digital platforms, especially when it comes to social media. First, a social media or a digital platform facilitates data-rich and relatively inexpensive communication, which means that people from anywhere in the country can coordinate. Secondly, social media have dramatically increased individuals' capacities to put forward their perspectives and voices, potentially to larger audience. So this increases visibility, as Margaret's et al. Refers it to, expansion of our possibilities for undertaking collective action in terms of how we might try to spread ideas or information and draw people in. And the third most important is that digital platforms enable users to almost instantaneously share information about ongoing events and other people's opinions and actions. And we have seen these examples during the Arab uprising in 2011. We have seen them in the recent Hong Kong protests as well. The other common themes that I found was that Pashtun nationalism and an emerging form of citizenship, especially in younger activists, or these people were focusing on doing that among the younger activists in Australia. There was a focus on long-term social transformation. So they're not only looking at what is happening today, especially through the inclusion of, as I said, young Pashtuns in the community. Use of digital audio, video, and streaming was frequent to experiment with horizontal collaboration. And there was direct relational links have also been established. And by that I mean that I will take from Taro's and McAdams' work from 2005, where they suggest that the adoption of new ideas, cultural objects, and practices does not depend on information alone, but also requires a modicum of identification between the innovator and the adopter. So PTM activism, I argue, among Australian Pashtuns started in 2018, and it has now, because of this reason, expanded, resulting in increasing identities and consumption patterns among the users or among the activists. And lastly, in addition to groups crowdsourcing evidence of violation, digital media platforms are also used to crowdsource the verification and analysis of evidence. One of them, in fact, two of them who are connectedly working together said that they are developing, as I said earlier, a database to put all those crowdsourcing evidence in, so basically curate them. I did not ask them, I did only ask them questions about funding in a very specific manner, because my concern is more towards social mobilization and collaboration. And as I saw the direct relational links or long-term social transformation that can occur through the diasporic use of digital media, specifically social media. So as I said, this is work in progress, and this is what I have so far gathered from my work around them, and I hope to see some new patterns emerge as well, but that's all for now.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. Let's all put our digital hands together for Ayesha, and I really find it fascinating, the overlap between our very different presentations and the common themes that emerge. And so it's interesting, right? Because Gregory's work was at one point focused on the open source intelligence and crowds and those databases that you're talking about. And also the direct horizontal links and just, yeah. All right, so I guess let us open the floor to the audience questions. If you would like to introduce yourself and ask anything. See, we have a few participants, or feel free to use the chat, whichever way is more convenient. Well, okay. If we don't have any audience questions, then maybe we could just talk to each other and yeah, and explore those overlaps and those various hybridities that emerge in these environments. So if I can perhaps ask the first question, which I guess Gregory talked about a little bit, right? How do you see it changing with COVID? So, so specifically to Michael and to Ayesha, and I guess to Gregory, because you just started talking about that in your presentation. But how do you see these processes that you talked about get, I don't know, accelerated or not? Or how do you see any changes that are going to happen because of COVID or after lockdown in your work?
Not on drone warfare specifically, but I think, you know, there's been a lot of interesting developments around policing and drones in response to the pandemic, and some of that is just an expansion of what we were already seeing. Some of it is kind of PR exercises where, you know, like when they announced the closure of the Victoria New South Wales border, the police were like, yeah, and we're going to like fly drones over the Murray River so that to check, you know, whether people are trying to swim across or whatever. Just kind of sort of this preposterous notion of a hyper surveilled domestic space. And I don't know whether they actually did it, but I'd be surprised if they did it in any kind of sustained way. But I do think that like one of the things we're seeing with the pandemic is an expansion of the logics of militarized surveillance and national security surveillance into a host of other spaces. And there's a really interesting, there's lots to say about that, and I won't kind of go off on that tangent right now, because I'm sure others have things to say as well. But there is a really interesting connection around this term surveillance that is used in spaces like this one, around like digital war studies, or around, I would say in sociology and in the humanities in general, surveillance carries a very negative connotation. Whereas in public health, it doesn't hold that at all. And in fact, like surveillance is a fairly neutral claim about what one does in response to an epidemic, or what one does in response to a public health crisis. You surveil it, you monitor it. It's a straightforward kind of statement. So it's interesting how when we have a crisis that is heavily policed in different kinds of ways, I wonder how much like how much the normalization of mediatized and algorithmic forms of surveillance get bound up with public health, and the more neutral way surveillance is kind of summoned up in that in those kinds of discourses. Sorry, I know that's maybe a bit unclear, but I guess what I'm saying is like, I think it's pretty interesting what people will accept in the context of a pandemic that they might not accept otherwise, because public health, the claim of public health seems to like authorize a fair amount of expansion of intrusive technologies, in the same way that the claim of security risk, you know, post 9/11, for instance, or in many other conflict situations, authorizes the erosion of civil liberties. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't be monitoring public health in various ways, but like we should also be asking questions at the same time about what that monitoring entails. And, you know, so, and whether that is like hyper technological or whether it is just in like the hardcore policing lockdown of public housing buildings in Melbourne, for instance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Michael. And I think one of your recent paper was about the everyday experiences of various kinds of drones, was it not? How people...
Yeah, yeah, I have a paper that just came out in Continuum called Drone Cultures, and it's just trying to kind of elaborate some of the more nuanced and subtle ways that the militarized dimensions of drones kind of creep into everyday life in a range of different ways. And so, yeah, I mean, it was written mostly written before the pandemic, and then I resisted the urge to rewrite the entire thing to kind of center some of the drone hysteria that's come about in the time since. But yeah, I think these are, you know, I was fascinated by Gregory's paper around participation, because it seemed to get at some of the kind of questions I've been trying to wrestle with as well, approaching it from a different set of methods and different set of theoretical touch points. But yeah, very interesting to see how we deal with these very complicated, like different ways of dealing with these very complicated ways that everyday life and war and militarism fold together.
I have a question, if people can hear me.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So my name is Abdullah, and I belong to Afghanistan. I've been in Australia for the last 4 years now, and I also am a Pashtun ethnically, and I speak Pashto as well. One of the things that Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan feel is that they are very much afraid of things in the sky. Because of all the bombings that have been done by the Soviet Union in Afghanistan for close to a decade, the average Afghan person is very much afraid of anything that shows up in the sky. I had it on a source that was very close to some of the Taliban leadership that was residing in the Waziristan area of Pakistan. That when the Americans started doing a lot of the drone bombings in those areas, a lot of those who survived those drone bombings and a lot of the leadership of Taliban, they would come over to main cities in Pakistan and actually would be seeking psychological help because they would be seeing drones in their dreams, and they would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and start, screaming, thinking that there's a drone attack happening or something. Do you think that, countries that do actually carry out drone attacks are also responsible somehow for the psychological health of the people that they are bombing, or that the civilians that are living around those areas, or the fear that they put into these people, because drones attacks are pretty scary. Maybe people, mistake the weaponized drones with drones that we see in kids' hands and people filming from them. But obviously, I think people don't appreciate the scale and the power a militarized, weaponized drone has, as compared to, it's pretty much like an F-16 coming at you, but without a pilot or something. So what are your thoughts on that? I'd like to know.
I guess I think Ayesha and Michael and Gregory have a lot to say about that. I'll just put in a kind of, so there is this constitution of crisis sociality is actually a topic of studies in sociology. And there's a whole book called Panic Diaries, written by Jackie Orr, where she explores those different kinds of media and how that media constitutes that crisis sociality and the panic attack disorders that emerge back from the Cold War, right, when we were all afraid of a nuclear catastrophe and also of many other different kinds of weapons of mass destruction or targeted destruction, and what it does to the sociality of the people and what happens to the social when these things happen. So that's just, I really liked the book, and I think it's very helpful, and it's interesting that we're discussing it right in a sociological conference, and that sociologists are so well positioned to really get at those everyday experiences of people who get to interact with those media. But that will be it for me, and perhaps Ayesha, Michael, or Gregory would like to say something.
I just would like to mention briefly that as a part of my research, I'm trying to actually explore the link between the sociological and psychological dimension of participation in conflicts. And I'm trying to conceptualize it as a link between socialization of conflict, which is all about increasing participation, and internalization of conflict, which is about how the conflict become a part of our cognitive structure of thinking around about the world around us, and to what extent the conflict become the major point of interpretive reference to different type of events or different type of social relations as well. So I think what you describe here is that the conflict actually become the major interpretive framework which we rely on, and we actually move from one place to another, but still our experiences stay as the major kind of form of interpretation. And and I think that what you describe about the dreams is actually, and it's very interesting, the additional dimension of internalization of conflicts. Because if we able to control rationally and understand that we move to another area where probably drones are not a threat anymore, still because of the significance of the experience and the risk and the threat from the past of these people, as you described, this has still become a part of our internal cognitive world, and it's very difficult to externalize it. And as a part of this model, what I'm trying actually that we have a socialization of conflict, which is about increasing participation, internalization of conflict when it becomes a part of our cognitive world. But then we need to think about externalization of conflict, is how actually different type of practices and techniques can help us actually to take the conflict out of us. And I think that this is something that we can see in psychology, when the purpose is actually to, first of all, identify the presence of the structures inside us, and then think how we actually can remove it from there in order to come back to the normal life. Because what you highlight again, that the conflict remain as a part of everyday life because of this internalization, and without externalization, it will be still there, even if we are in a very secured and peaceful environment. So thank you for this point.
I can hear an echo. Okay, I am not an expert in drone warfare, but having worked in Afghanistan and belonging to the northwestern tribal areas of Pakistan, I may like to add, first of all, of what I understand of my work and from being in that region is that when attackers attack, they're in a war mode, and so there is little to expect from them as to what will happen to the people. I mean, we recently just saw the debate around the killings by the Australian Defence Force military personnel in Afghanistan in cold blood, and I was looking at the discourse or the narrative that was generated through comments was that everything's fair in love and war, right? But yes, this is it's detrimental. They call it a part of the collateral damage, collateral psychological damage or political damage. But yes, there have been studies of political psychology that look at the psychological effects of drone violence. In drone warfare, I think this specific thing that you refer to, Abdullah, will become under drone violence. And so they have come up with 3 important psychological effects: social isolation, self-objectification, and depoliticization. And I think so far, and again, excuse me for my limited knowledge in drone warfare, probably Michael is the best person to respond to that later. I think this is something that is part of the collateral damage, and I think the responsibility is then thrown on to the government, the political government of that country, to be able to take care of their people, which I think governments in Pakistan and Afghanistan are not equipped to do. They are definitely not equipped. They're not even equipped to take care of refugees, for example. One of the most important aspect of displacement that I look at is refugee movement between Pakistan and Afghanistan and how they're affected. And so there are issues on their repatriation going on between the two countries. There are issues around their resettlement. And so I think, unfortunately, this is not even on their agenda. And probably Michael might want to add more into it.
Thanks, Abdullah. That's a really important question, I think, and one that is not sufficiently addressed, I think, either in academic research or and much more importantly by the countries that wage this kind of war. So, you know, I think Ayesha was maybe referring to Alex Edney Brown's work. She's done some ethnographic research where she looks at some similar things. Maybe it's something different, but yeah, self-objectifying and so on. Yeah, I mean, the militaries don't acknowledge this at all, really. I mean, in fact, there is quite a silence about the population effects of drone warfare from the militaries that wage it, even though clearly that those effects on populations and then of course on individuals within those populations is exactly what the warfare is about, really. I mean, you know, the capacity to carry out targeted killings of particular people or of particular signatures of people, which is you know, the kind of algorithmic background to some of these, to drone warfare. I mean, all of that is of course part of what, say, the US military is trying to do, but the other part of it is that it is about controlling a population, and it is about exerting a certain set, trying to exert a certain set of values and a certain set of actions on a population from above. And in this sense, it's no different from aerial warfare that we have had for the last 100+ years. And in fact, in many ways, it extends that form of aerial warfare more profoundly into the area of population control, because it's no longer about like the mass bombing of areas, or at least mostly it's not about the mass bombing of areas. And instead, it is about the ever-present threat of bombing those areas, right? So you live with the possibility that that any kind of whirring or buzzing noise that you hear, and of course that noise is incredibly distinct, and for, you know, for people who have to live under it is a kind of just an awful part of daily life. But all of that is like part of what is so appealing about this form of warfare to countries like the United States. And I mean, you know, we see a different version of this in Israel's use of drones in Gaza in particular, where the drones fly much lower than they do in Afghanistan or Pakistan or other places where America uses them, and where that constant presence, right, that psychological impact on life and that disruption of daily life is far more overt and deliberate. It's not just like we want to have this effect in general. It's like, no, we want you to have to deal with this in a kind of permanent, inescapable way. There's a really powerful book by it's late here. It's been a long day. I'm gonna forget his name. Abu Satif, I think. The book's called The Drone Eats With Me. And it's a diary of his time in during I think it was Operation Cast Lead, Israeli operation over Gaza, and you know, just the ever presence of drones and the like drone bombs going down, not just blowing up houses, but coming into living rooms and kitchens and physical spaces, which is a kind of really brutal inversion of what Gregory was talking about, where the participation in war comes into the home through digital media. So yeah, I mean, I actually think that like in many ways, this is like the larger political problem that we should be trying to address and make significant, because within a certain logic of national defense and of militarism, drone warfare seems quite justifiable to many people, I think, right? Like from the perspective of American publics or Australian publics or wherever, British publics, who are all responsible in many ways for this type of warfare, it's appealing because it seems to like offer a means of prosecuting war, which we don't want to do, but sometimes you have to. But while being more precise, more surgical, more accurate, all the while protecting our soldiers and our blood, right, from harm. And the conversation cuts off there, right? Whereas like those profound effects on societies and cultures are not sufficiently being addressed. I mean, as you can probably tell, I think it's terrible and outrageous, and it should be a point of political debate and public debate in Australia, in the UK, in the US, and it's not. Anyway, I'll stop from there. Thank you for bringing that up.
Answers. I think these are wonderful answers. I guess the Soviets, when they wanted to terrorize a particular village or a particular people in Afghanistan, they would burn their crops and they would poison the well water over there. And I guess drones have a similar effect on the psychology of people and poisoning their peace. Yeah, there's a lot of similarity in my. Another point I wanted to mention, I think that Michael, you're very much right about I think the drones have kind of a very soft spot in the Western world and in general as well, for them to being kind of like very technological thing that gets the job done without much, fuss and things like that. But as I said, like even for myself, for a long time, I did not see the drones as the destructive machines that they actually are. I think the analogy or the comparison with the drones that we see is the thing that you would think that they might carry a small, bullet or something, or a very small, missile, and then it will be very targeted. But in actual, they are very mean war machines. And I think one of the movies which kind of changed that perspective for me is a movie called The Bourne Legacy. It's part of the Bourne movies, which it is the one that Matt Damon did not act in. And there's a drone strike shown in that movie, and I hadn't watched any movies show a drone strike before, and yeah, that was that really scary way of showing a drone, and it changed kind of my perspective. And I think that kind of imagery does change people's reaction or thoughts about drones as well. Just wanted to add that to the point.
Thank you so much for your question and for everyone's comments. And so I see we have a question from Barbara that the technology is the focus as mediator in your studies, but what about the producers of these technologies who are pulling the strings? Have you given thought to them? So I think it's interesting, right, how in the context of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing that Gregory and I have looked into, it is now possible to perhaps renegotiate some of these supply streams. And if it's possible to crowdfund for a drone that would counteract the enemy's drone or be used for surveillance on the other side, kind of. So I think that does perhaps renegotiate some power relationships that emerge around the conflict. That's probably all I have to say, that there are a lot of alternative supply chains that are now surrounding the battlefronts in many countries, such as Ukraine. And yeah, so manufacturers aside, the distribution part is probably changing a little bit. Perhaps somebody would like to jump in.
Just to add to Barbara's comment, in this session, when I was in the week that we were talking about digital activism with my students at the University of Sydney, two things. First of all, we struggled so much, the entire team, with our students who were based in China because they couldn't access Twitter. And we were specifically looking at Twitter as a tool for political engagement and activism. And specifically looking at the Hong Kong protests, and we couldn't. And then and so we had to ask them to use others. So basically censorship goes a long way in authoritarian states. And sometimes democratic countries will use this as an excuse, or will use an excuse of national security to be able to stop people from from any kind of information that they might want to have. I've just shared an article. It's a news article, but quite interesting because it gives a case study of the Hong Kong protests, but it specifically talks about how the app that was developed to help protesters was actually later used by the state to attack them and to make and also these companies such as I mentioned, Apple, China is one of their biggest markets. Their stock markets go up and down. The price of their stocks share in the stock market goes up and down depending on how the company is doing in China. And so they can't take a risk by pissing off these governments. Yeah. So I think, and as I said, a very important app was removed by Apple just because the Chinese Communist Party decided that it cannot be accessed by people because it was helping the protesters. So yes, there will be technology, they will ban it, people will create more. Open source, for example, Olga was mentioning earlier. And that's why we try our best to keep internet activism at the same time, as well as JP Barlow has been calling for, the freedom of the cyberspace. So let's see, we'll always find a way. They will block it, we'll find it, they'll block it and we'll find it. And I think that's what's been happening across the world.
Yeah, that's what's so non-deterministic about it, right? That it's, there's a lot of ways around it. It's not the technology that gets to determine our engagement and participation.
I would just say, that in my work, in some ways, the military weapons manufacturers are going to do what they do. There's been companies manufacturing weapons for a very long time, and unfortunately, we'd need a pretty radical transformation of the world for them to stop doing it. But the development that really worries me, and it's already well underway, is the integration of the large tech providers in the AI and machine learning space with military systems. So, companies like Microsoft and Oracle have provided software services to the US military, for example, for a really long time. And most of it is fairly uncontroversial. A lot of it is basically the same as what the relationship our universities have, right? They're like, it's enterprise software, maybe hardened up and better encrypted and whatnot, but it's basically just enterprise software services. But where the private industry has just streaked so far ahead of militaries is in AI and machine learning. Traditional military procurement processes take a really long time. They tend to work with very particular kinds of companies that have long track records, that are politically connected, et cetera, et cetera. This is particularly in the US, but the same is true elsewhere. And so they actually just haven't been very good at software development and AI and machine learning technologies in particular. And so, the US military is, partnering with Amazon. They use Amazon Web Services and various kinds of cloud computing technologies that Amazon has. They're working more and more with Google. We don't know what they're doing with Microsoft now, using Microsoft's Azure machine learning systems. So there is like a really concerning set of developments there in a space where private industry has just streaked far ahead of militaries. The flip side to that, and an argument that is strongly made in a lot of in the public discourse as well as from companies themselves, is that China is already far ahead in that integration between privately developed AI systems and the state apparatus, and so this is like the West keeping up with what's happening elsewhere. I don't kind of have a horse in that debate, except to say that like we should be deeply, deeply concerned about these developments, whether they're happening in China or Russia or in the United States. And I think that the point of political pressure, or the potential point of political pressure, is the consumer services companies. And we saw that with the example I was talking about in my paper about Project Maven at Google, where Google's staff were able to result in a change of policy for Google. And I think that there is potential to force companies away from that type of work and to slow that kind of development. But it's a very, very worrying trend.
Thank you, Michael. And Gregory, would you like to say something?
Yeah, just to maybe kind of try to present very brief concluding contribution to this discussion. I think that if we really try to connect the different type of crisis situations and military conflicts and COVID-19 as well, we can see that every crisis is a kind of new momentum of innovation. And it's all about innovation related to new forms of participation, but also new forms of control. And when we think about this crisis-related innovation, if it's about armed conflicts or about other crisis situations as well, first, there are a lot of commonalities and common denominators that we need to identify. But I think the major point is really about this tension of approaching people as subjects that potentially you can collaborate with, or objects that need to be controlled. And this is something that potentially can be seen in the context of different type of crisis situations. And the point that was mentioned that actually also the crisis situation is a type of state of exception from the point of view of state actors relying on Agambenburg. So they try to push new forms of using technologies, new forms of legitimacy to apply technologies for the purpose of control. And that's where we need to be very critical about these arguments about these applications. So I think that the point of how actually technologies are used to govern the crowds in the context of crisis situations probably is a major kind of point of concern if it's about armed conflicts or if it's about COVID-19 as well.
Thank you, Gregory. I think I will have to end this discussion because we're running over time already. But thank you to all the presenters one more time. And thank you for participants, Abdullah, Barbara, and all our other participants for such a lively discussion. I think it was really a very productive space, right, of just connecting our seemingly disparate ideas, right, and understanding the connections between them as it relates to digital war. So thank you all again, and be sure to check Michael's podcast, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us in a very unconventional time, right, late in the afternoon for us and very early for Gregory, but I'm very glad that we were able to make this happen.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olga, and thanks so much for organizing. Really appreciate you taking the initiative and doing such a great job chairing.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Olga. Thank you to everyone, and be in touch. Great presentation. Thanks.
Right.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for the really terrific questions. Really appreciate it.
Yes, great discussion. Okay. All right. Bye.